So we're going to begin with a short history of neuromarketing in the popular press. And I think this illustrates, for me, the diverging responses between the general public and academics to the use of neuroscience in marketing. So first, this is from a colleague of mine, Helco Plasman, who plots out the rise of neuromarketing over the first decade of this century. What you see is that there's a slow rise both in the number of Google hits for the term neuromarketing, as well as for the number of publications and marketing journals that use some kind of neuroscience technology, as well as for the companies who call themselves neuromarketers. What you'll notice is that one of these rises precedes the other two. So the rise in Google hits spikes up right in the year 2004, and that precedes the lagging rise in the use of neuroscience in academic journals, as well as the lagging rise in the use of neuroscience in marketing companies. And basically the talk today is going to go through each of these three lines. So we're going to start with the first one, which is neuromarketing in the popular press. So what happened in 2004? Well, what happened in 2004 was there was a series of articles, one in Forbes magazine, which was about finding the buy button, and another in the New York Times magazine, which popularized this idea that people were using neuroscience to understand what consumers want, and that the implication was that then use this to somehow manipulate consumers into wanting companies' products. And I think the response to these articles illustrates the diverging views that the general public and academics have had to the use of neuromarketing. So on the side of the general public, this series of articles in Forbes and the New York Times led to the organization Commercial Alert, who was started by Ralph Nader, to send a letter to Congress asking them to investigate neuromarketing. This is a quote from the letter. So, what would happen in this country if corporate marketers and political consultants could literally peer inside our brains and chart the neural activity that leads to our selections in the supermarket and the voting booth? What if they could then trigger this neural activity by various means so as to modify our behavior to serve their own ends? We Americans may find out sooner than we think. Orwellian is not too strong a term for this prospect, yet this research is happening right now, conducted by neuroscience and marketing professors affiliated with some of this nation's most prestigious universities, such as Harvard, Baylor, Caltech, Penn State, and Emory. They are using medical technologies such as functional magnetic resonance imaging not to heal the sick, but rather to probe the human psyche for the purpose of influencing it. This new field is called neuromarketing, and those involved are near euphoric in the possibilities for the marketing industry. So I think the response on the part of the general public to these articles about neuromarketing was one that granted that the scientific claims in the articles were true, and then was very scared about what the implications were. The general tone here is that neuromarketing is going to be able to turn consumers into zombies that will purchase whatever products marketers want you to purchase. This could not have been any more different from the response on the part of the academic community to this series of articles. So the academic community, and an example of this is an editorial that was published in Nature Neuroscience. The academic community this is just yet another example of, hucksterism, essentially, that the claims were overblown and that the science simply wasn't there to support the claims that were made in these articles. So the Nature Neuroscience editorial says, the prospect of big corporations or political lobbyists enlisting brain science to manipulate consumer and voter behavior has inevitably raised concerns in some quarters. A watchdog agency, founded by consumer advocate Ralph Nader, for instance, has asked the U.S. government to investigate neuromarketing companies on public health grounds. But given the current state of the science, these worries seem premature. Cognitive science is not yet close to explaining or predicting human decision-making in the real world. And their conclusion about the science leads them to interpret the behavior of those involved on the marketing side a little differently. So what they say about the individuals involved is that if the media hype is to be believed, then fMRI is being exploited by savvy consulting companies intent on finding the buy button in the brain, and is on the verge of creating advertising campaigns that we will be unable to resist. A more skeptical view of neuromarketing is that cognitive scientists, many of whom watched from the sidelines as their molecular colleagues got rich, are now jumping on the commercial bandwagon. According to this view, neuromarketing is a little more than a new fad exploited by scientists and marketing consultants to blind corporate clients with science. This is an example of the two different ethical responses on the part of the general public and scientists to neuromarketing. I'm going to go in a little bit more depth on both of these sides. But I think what you'll see is that the general public tends to believe the claims about the science and then think that this is very scary. On the academic side, there seems to be, there's a complete skepticism that any of the scientific claims have any merit whatsoever. And so then the ethical issue is just, how should we respond to yet another instance of someone selling snake oil? So first on the public side, this is a survey I got from my colleague Hilke Plassmann on what does the public think neuroscience can do and what does the public think neuroscience should do. So what you see here is a response to a bunch of different questions about, do you think neuroscience is able to do the following? Not at all, to some extent, or very well. And what you see is that at the time this survey was taken, it's still the case that the majority of people did not think that neuroscience was capable of finding out what you were thinking or to find out your political views. However, when you get to things like, can it find out what kind of products you prefer to buy, or can it find out whether you're lying, now the majority thinks that either to some extent or completely, neuroscientists are capable, current technology is capable of doing those things. And then, of course, as you move down to medical applications, a vast majority think that in terms of being able to diagnose disease such as tumors, neuroscience is capable of doing that. So there's some belief that the current technology is able to determine what products you prefer to buy or to find out whether you're lying. And there's a corresponding belief that this is something that neuroscience should not be used to do. So now this question is, what do you think? What do you think that neuroscientists should do? How do you think that neuroscience should be used? And a vast majority think it's okay to use it for scientific research or medical purposes. But when it comes to using it as part of advertising research, or showing that you're not lying in a clinical criminal investigation, or as part of a job interview, or as part of an interview to get insurance, the vast majority of people think that that's not an appropriate use of neuroscience technology. So there's this belief that we're capable of telling what products you prefer to buy, and a belief that that's not okay. That's not an appropriate use of neuroscience. And I think this has led, in some cases, the commercial alert campaign was not successful in getting Congress to investigate neuromarketing companies. However, there's a similar campaign that went on in France, and there's now a law in France that prohibits the use of imaging technologies by marketing companies. It prohibits it in business. Now, on the flip side, from the academic perspective, there's a strong skepticism of the basic claims that the technology is there to measure what products people would prefer to buy, for example. And I think there are two further incidents that give you a sense of why academics have this skepticism. Both involve the editorial page of the New York Times, and both may have been raised by Jeff in his lecture this morning. The first one came 3 years after the Forbes and New York Times Magazine articles, when an op-ed was published on the New York Times editorial page by a group of academics that were involved in a consulting company that was doing political consulting around the 2008 election. This article, this editorial, This Is Your Brain on Politics, reported a functional brain imaging experiment that was looking at ads for the 2008 campaign, and then reported the conclusions of these consultants about different candidates, the state of different candidates today. And it said things like, it made a number of different conclusions. One of the conclusions was that voters sense both peril and promise in party brands. When we show subject the words Democrat, Republican, and Independent, they exhibited high levels of activity in the part of the brain called the amygdala, indicating anxiety. Similarly, they concluded that emotions about Hillary Clinton were mixed. When viewing images of her, these voters exhibited significant activity in the anterior cingulate cortex, an emotional center of the brain that is aroused when a person feels compelled to act in two different ways, but must choose one. And the flavor of all of their conclusions were of this way. So we see high activity in the amygdala when voters see the words Democrat or Republican. Therefore, Democrat and Republican are arising anxiety because of other studies where the amygdala was active in response to anxiety. This almost immediately led to a response on the part of a large group of cognitive neuroscientists who both challenged the scientific conclusions of the article as well as as well as whether it was appropriate for the New York Times to essentially publish a paid advertisement for a political consulting company. So this is one of the people who led up this response was Russ Poldrack, who's now at the University of Texas. And the part of their response was published as a letter to the New York Times is shown here. So what they said was, as cognitive neuroscientists who use the same brain imaging technology, we know that it's not possible to definitively determine whether a person is anxious or feeling connected simply by looking at activity in a particular brain region. This is so because brain regions are typically engaged by many mental states, and thus a one-to-one mapping between a brain region and a mental state is not possible. As cognitive neuroscientists, we're very excited about the potential use of brain imaging techniques to better understand the psychology of political decisions, but we are distressed by the publication of research in the press that has not undergone peer review and that uses flawed reasoning to draw unfounded conclusions about topics as important as the presidential election. So what you see here is both a comment about, was it appropriate for the New York Times to publish the editorial in the first place, given the players, and also given that it's a scientific claim and that there's certain expectations that with respect to scientific claims that you're going to look for peer review of the research rather than what was done here, as well as a claim that went to the heart of the scientific part of the original article, which was that it's not logically correct to say, I observed activity in the amygdala, therefore you're feeling anxiety. That in the vast majority of cases, there's not a one-to-one mapping between activity in specific brain areas and specific psychological states, such that you can read off psychological states just by clinically looking at a brain scan and seeing a blob in the amygdala. Unfortunately, this a very similar event occurred more recently. So 4 years after the FKF editorial, there was yet another op-ed on the New York Times editorial page. This one was written by Martin Lindstrom, and it was for a long time the most emailed article from the New York Times. Lindstrom, interestingly, is a neuromarketer. He owns a neuromarketing company. He's published several books on neuromarketing, such as this one, Biology. I believe his company is also called Biology. So again, this is a case where essentially what the New York Times is publishing is an ad for a company that's selling consulting services. In Lindstrom's case, he was looking at people's responses to pictures of iPhones, and he says, but what was most striking of all was the flurry of activation in the insular cortex of the brain, which is associated with feelings of love and compassion. The subject's brains responded to the sound of their phones as they would respond to the presence of or proximity of a girlfriend, boyfriend, or family member. In short, the subjects didn't demonstrate the classic brain-based signs of addiction. Instead, they loved their iPhones. And once again, very quickly, a group of neuroscientists responded to this, again led by Russ Poldrack. And their response reads as simply reprinting the response to the FKF article. So the kind of reasoning that Lindstrom used is well known to be flawed because, again, there's rarely a one-to-one mapping between any brain region and a single mental state. Insular activity could reflect one or more of several psychological processes. The same point was made by some of us regarding a similar op-ed piece in 2007. We are disappointed that the Times has published extravagant claims based on scientific data that have not been subjective to the standard scientific review process, especially considering how often its pages exhort policymakers to pay more attention to peer-reviewed scientific evidence and disregard specious claims. So again, a challenge to the scientific claim that you can't simply observe activity in the insula and assume someone's in love. The full letter also goes into this is a case where it's not even clear that observing insula activity would make it more likely that someone's experiencing positive emotion. A reading of most of the evidence would actually suggest the opposite. So this was, it's not even, the claim is wrong on several levels. A complaint about the publication of scientific evidence that doesn't reach the standards of peer review, and as well, I think there's a concern that given the people involved, is it appropriate for the editorial page to be publishing what's essentially a paid advertising for a consultant? And so I think what this has left, so while the public thinks that, believes the claims and thinks that it's inappropriate for marketing companies to use this technology, the view on the side of academics is quite different. And I think most academics, in response to FKF and in response to Lindstrom, feel they can either take a more or less cynical view of it. I think the very cynical view is that what we're looking at here is simply what you would call bullshitting. And so for an academic, the worry is that the people who are making these claims don't even have a concern with the truth. So as Harry Frankfurt writes in his essay on bullshit, it is impossible for someone to lie unless he thinks he knows the truth. Producing bullshit requires no such conviction. So the idea here is that they're not even trying to engage in truth claims, but rather to engage in claims that make themselves look good. And that's what academics feel is dangerous. A more charitable interpretation, I think, would be how Robert Park, in his book Voodoo Science, writes about several different categories of pseudoscience. In this case, it's not, he doesn't actually deal with neuromarketing. He's dealing with other things like cold fusion. And what he says is that practitioners of pseudoscience may believe it to be science, just as witches and faith healers may truly believe they can call forth supernatural powers. What may begin as an honest error, however, has a way of evolving through almost imperceptible steps from self-delusion to fraud. So I think the charitable interpretation is that you have people who may not know that their claims aren't true and that they're simply self-deceiving. So let me then move on to the second section, which, as I was saying, summarize it, gives you a quick whirlwind tour of the last 10 years of applying neuroscience to decision-making and consumer behavior, and basically gives you a sense of what I think, what our understanding of basic things like liking and preference, as well as where there might be some uses here for neuroscience in marketing. I should say before doing that in part you can tell based on the academic response to the New York Times editorial their general view, and I think in part of their general view of the term neuromarketing, most of the people who do this work in academia would not call themselves a neuromarketer. They wouldn't go near that term. Even if they're in a marketing department in a business school using fMRI, they would call themselves a consumer neuroscientist or a decision neuroscientist. In a explicit attempt to distinguish themselves from private firms. That's breaking down a little bit slowly, but there's still very much this effort on the parts of academics to distinguish what they're doing. Much of the work that's been done in decision and consumer neuroscience has focused on a specific subset of frontal striatal circuits. This is a very complicated diagram of those circuits that shows that multiple parts of the frontal cortex project to multiple parts of a subcortical structure called the striatum, and then those projections go back. And there's a view that as these circuits proceed, they proceed from the ventral to more dorsal areas. You're going from areas that are more involved in valuation and preference to areas that are more involved in action planning and choice, and that the entire dynamic of evaluating to choosing may be instantiated in these circuits from the ventral to the dorsal segments. What I'm going to go through is some of the evidence that specifically implicates the red areas, so the ventromedial prefrontal cortex and the ventral striatum, in evaluation and preference. So signals that are related to how do people evaluate different options in a decision-making setting, different potential rewards in a decision-making setting, and evidence that in both of these areas there's activity that you can detect with functional brain imaging that scales with the extent to which someone likes, prefers, desires the option that they're currently evaluating. In all of these cases, the approach that was used in the functional imaging study is to first get some kind of behavioral measure of preference. So I give you a choice between two objects, you choose one, and so I know that you prefer that one over the other. So I have some measure, and in all of these cases, preference is idiosyncratic. So some people prefer one thing, other people prefer a different thing. So I have a measure of your idiosyncratic preference, and then I'm going to look for either a categorical contrast between brain activity to the things that you prefer compared to the things that you don't prefer, or I'm going to look at a correlation between your extent of preference and brain activity. And in all of these cases, there's fairly consistent evidence that you can observe either a categorical signal or a correlation between bold activity in these two areas, ventromedial prefrontal cortex and ventral striatum, and someone's preference. So one domain where this has been shown is my own research, which deals with intertemporal dilemmas, choices between immediate monetary rewards and delayed monetary rewards. So we can measure who are the individuals who have a strong preference for immediate rewards versus delayed rewards, who are the individuals who are more likely to delay. I can then use that to identify how much you prefer any given option of a certain amount of money at a certain point in time. And medial prefrontal cortex and ventral striatum activity, bold activity in those two areas scales with your preference for immediate and delayed rewards. This has also been shown in the domain of monetary gambles. Again, people have idiosyncratic preferences. Some people like to gamble, other people like to play it safe. I can measure those, and then I can look for a correlation between your preference for any given gamble and brain activity. And you see a correlation between those two in medial prefrontal cortex and ventral striatum. Similarly, I can ask you about a bunch of different consumer goods. And ask how much you'd be willing to pay for different consumer goods. And again, using this approach, I can see a correlation between activity in these two regions and your preference for consumer goods. And this correlation does not seem to be restricted to cases in which you are evaluating something for yourself for sort of purely selfish reasons. So I can also ask people their preferences about charitable giving. I can give them a bunch of different decisions between keeping certain amounts of money for themselves versus giving that money away to charities. And individuals differ. They have idiosyncratic preferences for how much they're willing to give away at all, and then how much they're willing to give away to different charities. I can measure those, and again, your extent of preference for any given charitable transfer scales with bold activity in ventral striatum and ventromedial prefrontal cortex. There have now been dozens of studies like this, hundreds of studies if you use a slightly more liberal classification. And recently, we've meta-analyzed all of these studies. So to ask the question, where is there a reliable signal when you use this approach? Where do you get a reliable, repeatable signal across different studies? All of these studies are in very different domains, so some of them are about monetary choice, some of them are about immediate versus delayed rewards, some of them are about risky versus certain rewards, some of them are about different kinds of primary choices, so this kind of juice versus that kind of juice. So it's the whole gamut of potential decision-making and preference tasks. But across this whole gamut, the two places where you get a reliable correlation between bold activity and preference are the ventromedial prefrontal cortex and the ventral striatum. Now, at this point, I want to remind you, so I think that is, if you were to go to an academic conference on neuroscience and decision-making and consumer behavior, there would be no disputes of this particular finding of a correlation between bold activity and preference or the value that you assign to particular options in these two areas. But at this point, I'd like to remind you about the concern that was raised in response to those New York Times editorials, which is what I've shown you so far is that when I have a behavioral measure of preference, I can predict brain activity. So I have a behavioral measure of what you prefer over this group of consumer goods, or what you prefer over these different kinds of monetary rewards, and I can predict something about the brain activity that will be generated by viewing those rewards, by evaluating those rewards. However, that does not mean that I can go in the opposite direction, which is observe brain necessarily. It doesn't mean necessarily that I can go in the opposite direction, which is observe brain activity and predict something about preference. So there are many ways in which you can understand this. It basically boils down to the one-line sentence from the response to the New York Times editorials about a one-to-one. There isn't a one-to-one mapping in general between brain areas and psychological states. So the logical flaw here is the flaw of affirming the consequent. What we know is if A, then B. So if preference, then brain activity in a certain area. That does not mean that if we observe B, we can then conclude A. So that that only logically follows if I know if and only if A, then B. So it only logically follows if there's a one-to-one mapping. This is the article that outlines that argument against this kind of logic of reverse inference, so seeing brain activity and making an assumption about psychological states. And in general, I think you want to be very cautious of people who use this kind of, people who are engaging in reverse inference. However, in this particular case, regarding brain activity and preference, there's been a lot of work in the last 5 years to both investigate the extent to which this might be a special case where there is more specificity regarding the relationship between brain activity and psychological states, as well as developing the proper statistical tools that would allow you to validly make the inference from brain activity to psychological processes. This is a place where there's been a lot of advances in the last 5 or 10 years. I'm not quite sure whether Jeff went through it or not, but basically I'm talking about things like multivoxel pattern analysis, which are essentially the statistical way in which you can go the other direction from brain states to psychological processes. So first, I'll point you to this article by Dan Ariely and Greg Burns in Nature Reviews Neuroscience, where what they do is they go through and evaluate, based on the scientific literature, the probability, what you would conclude about the probability that someone is experiencing a reward given that you see activation in the nucleus accumbens. This is the relevant probability for doing reverse inference. I see a brain activity. What can I conclude about the probability that they're in a given state? And what Poldrack argues in his article is that that probability is not very high, for example, for Broca's area in language, that the probability is not much higher than 0.5. What the response to the New York Times editorials argue is that that probability is not very high for amygdala and anxiety. And what they argue about the insula is that that probability may be less than 0.5 for observing insula activity and then concluding that someone loves their iPhone. In the case of ventral striatum and reward, though, what Ariely and Burns show is that if you take the same data that they're using in those other cases, the probability that someone is experiencing a reward, given that you see nucleus accumbens activation, is actually 0.9. If you take all of the same assumptions that Poldrak used in his TICS article. Now you can argue about whether the data on which you calculated that probability is unbiased data. It's basically a sampling of all the imaging studies that have ever been published. You can think of many ways in which that might not be a completely unbiased sampling, but it at least suggests that this question of whether there's a one-to-one mapping is one that's specific to brain areas rather than general. That there might be specific cases where the validity of a reverse inference may be stronger than others. And that this particular case of the nucleus accumbens may be one of those where the validity of a reverse inference may be stronger than others. Subsequently, there's been work that has used techniques like multivoxel pattern analysis, where you're trying to build a statistical model that would decode brain states, that would decode psychological states from brain evidence. And that approach has met with some success in the cases of trying to predict people's evaluations and preferences. So this is one example of a study where what they had individuals do was sit in the scanner and look at pictures of different cars. I think this study was done in Germany. I don't know whether whether it was funded by the automotive industry or not. And so they had individuals watch this sequence of cars. After the scan, they then asked the individuals, is this a car that you would think about purchasing, or is this a car that you would not think about purchasing? There were two different conditions, one where they had to really pay attention to the sequence of cars and process each car individually, another one where there was no particular attentional demands to pay attention to each specific sequence of cars. And what they showed is that using a multivoxel pattern analysis in medial prefrontal cortex, they were able to predict those cars which individuals said they would think about purchasing. They were able to distinguish those cars which individuals said they would think about purchasing from those that they said they wouldn't at a level of 75%, where chance is 50%. So this is fantastic news for practicing neuroscientists, because it says we're making some progress about understanding the basis of decision making. Whether going from 50% to 75% is practically useful, I think, is a different question. There's now been several other papers that have used the same kind of approach. One in the domain of purchasing small consumer goods, or actually all of them, I think, are in the domain of purchasing small consumer goods, all of which meet with about the same level of success in being able to decode on the basis of brain states whether this is an item that someone would purchase versus not. So that's being able to predict at an individual level. I have that individual on the scanner. Can I predict whether this is something that someone will purchase or not? You can also ask the question about whether seeing brain activity over a group of individuals then predicts to another group of individuals, a more broader group of individuals. And there's some very recent evidence that suggests that in ventral striatum and medial prefrontal cortex, brain activity in one group of individuals has some predictive power about what a different group of individuals might prefer. The first example is work by Greg Burns at Emory. The backstory here is that Burns did a study. He was interested in social pressure and people's susceptibility to social influence. And so he had a study of adolescents listening to music in the scanner and then gave them ratings of other adolescents and saw how much did that influence their own ratings of the music. So what he had was brain data of adolescents listening to basically unknown bands. And then about 5 years later, he was watching American Idol, and this song came on. So I'm curious, is there anyone in the audience who knows that song? What is it? You know the song, but this is interesting. I've done this in several different groups. When I give my lecture to the undergrads, all the hands go up. So this is the individual singing the song is Chris Allen, who was on American Idol. The song is by a band called One Republic. The name of the song is Apologize. I think Justin Timberlake. The song went skyrocketed because there was Justin Timberlake was on a piece of it. Basically, what the incident, but the reason that this struck Burns was that he knew that this was one of the songs that was in his study 5 years ago. So at the time, One Republic was an unknown band that they just downloaded off of MySpace, and now 5 years into the future, they've taken off. And so he was interested in, and there were a couple of cases where this happened, and he was interested in whether brain activity in adolescence at the time, when the bands were unknown, would predict future cultural popularity. What he found, going back to the data, so this is a map, again, of the relationship between bold activity and stated preference at the time, again showing medial prefrontal cortex and ventral striatum. And when he went into ventral striatum, what he found was a correlation at the level of 0.3 between activity in ventral striatum and the log of future sales by this band, suggesting that maybe there is something in that signal when measured in one group of individuals that could predict future popularity in a different group of individuals. I think that this is, I would classify this as interesting evidence that needs to be replicated for us to really believe that the signal is there. But it suggests that it's not absurd to think that there might be a signal in brain activity that predicts future cultural popularity. A similar kind of study has been done by Emily Falk, who's now joining us at the Annenberg School. Emily's work is interested in, she's a communications person, and so she's interested in working with public health campaigns to make better anti-smoking ads. So in her study, what she had was individuals who were watching ads from 3 different anti-smoking campaigns. This is an example of one of them.
Dad, I thought you were quitting.
Honey, I tried the patch, the gum, and the hypnosis. There's nothing else I can do.
Hello, you're a finger.
Quitting's hard, but dialing 1-800-QUIT now is easy.
Okay. So there were 3 different classes of ads. One was sort of hilarious, was sort of trying to hit humor, like this one. I think others may have been more serious in their focus, but there were 3 different ad campaigns that were rolled out in 3 different areas of the country. And they had data on the increasing call volume to the 1-800-QUIT line from those areas in which the ad campaign was rolled out, so they could measure the effectiveness of the ad campaign. And they had brain imaging data from a group of individuals watching these different ads. And what she found was very interesting. So if you look here at the effectiveness rating at the time, so they had the individuals rate the effectiveness of the given ads. The individuals rated campaign B as most effective and campaign C as least effective. If you look at call volume turns out that campaign C, which was rated on self-report as least effective, was the one that was most effective in raising call volume. And campaign C's ads were also the ones that caused the greatest activity in medial prefrontal cortex. I think what's surprising here is, again, that bold activity measured in one group predicts something about the behavior of another group. It seems to do so over and above the kinds of self-report measures that you can gather. I don't want to be too, I think that things are still very early days for this particular approach. This is one study, and there are only 3 campaigns, so there's certainly a possibility for false positives here, but this at least, again, suggests that it's not ridiculous to think that you could measure something in brain activity in one group of individuals and predict something about a different group of individuals. So I'll just do a few more minutes. I know much less about neuromarketing in practice and how this is actually being used by marketing companies in the field, but I'm going to talk through a little bit what I do know, and here I think Ray's again come back to what might be perceived ethical issues versus vis-a-vis real ethical issues. So the first thing to recognize is that there are, so if you go back to that original graph that I showed about the growth of neuromarketing, the access on neuromarketing companies has about 100 neuromarketing companies as of right now. This is a plot of their distribution across the globe, and so they're on every continent. There are companies that claim to do neuromarketing. All of these companies are verified to be, in fact, marketing companies that sell some kind of service that they're calling neuromarketing. Only about 20% of them are selling a service that involves brain imaging. So this goes back to what is the technology that's actually being used in the field. So there's certainly marketing companies that are selling this as a product. What are they doing, and are any of the, given what we know about scientific possibilities from the second section, are any of the concerns that the public had in the first section relevant? So one way in which you might think of them using it, what the commercial alert letter was concerned about was this individual level prediction. So I have a measure from you, and I can predict something about what you're going to buy based on your brain activity. I think that is not, and then the worry is there an issue, is there a privacy concern there, that now I have detected something that you didn't want to give me, and I'm using it to predict your behavior. I think practically that's not how neuromarketing is going to be used in the field, both for technological reasons. We don't know how to force you, putting you into a brain, it's just simply not plausible that I'm going to put you into a brain scanner to try and measure brain activity of an individual consumer. And even when you get to less invasive technologies, it's, again, not very plausible that I'm going to be able to get a measure at the individual level. Even if I was able to get a measure at the individual level, I think most marketing companies don't see that as potentially useful to them, because they already have very good ways, quantitative ways, of knowing something about your likely purchases at the individual level. There was a recent article in the New York Times, again, that demonstrated some of this. So this was a story about so the title was How Companies Learn Your Secrets. One of the anecdotes in the story was, a lot of it was through an interview with the marketing arm of Target about how they use publicly available information in order to dig down to the level of the individual and say, you're likely to buy this. And so the thing that I think gleaned the most attention from this article was their ability to predict who pregnant mothers often, before the time that they would have, before the time that they would have revealed to anyone that they were pregnant, and then send marketing specifically targeting them for their future purchases. this is not just used, this kind of technology that exists to use publicly available data to predict, or use data that's easily available to predict at the individual level is not just in the private domain. There were many articles in the last election campaign about the kinds of statistical techniques that the Obama, it was thought that the Obama, one of the advantages of the Democratic campaign was their so-called Moneyball strategy at the, at the level of trying to make specific predictions about the views of specific voters based on the data that they had, and then to target your campaign strategy to specific voters on the basis of that data. And one of the perceived advantages of the Democrats over the Republicans in the last election was that they were doing this better than the Republicans were. So I think in practice, the using data at the individual level to predict something about an individual is not where neuroscience is at least right now, going to be used. I think the two places where marketers might use neuroscience were, so this is from, again, the Ariely and Burns piece. They argue that the two places would be in designing products, so like with the song study, so designing better songs or designing better movies, designing better products, or in designing better advertising. And in both of those cases, what marketers are going to do is try and get a measure from one group of individuals that predicts how a different group of individuals is going to prefer a product or how they're going to respond to an ad. And I think when you realize that that's how, so another way of putting it is that the uses of neuroscience are going to be less on the quant side of marketing, which is involved in saying, what do you as an individual who live at this address purchase? And more on the creative side of marketing, that where they see the potential use is on that creative side where they don't feel like they have good measures, necessarily very good measures of, is this a good product? Is this a good advertisement? Where evaluations in the past have been much more qualitative, and there's some belief that perhaps the quantitative data from neuroscience might be useful. And I think when you frame it like that, then the ethical issue, if there is one, becomes why would using neuroscience to develop products be any different than using other information to develop products? Why would using neuroscience to develop ads be any different than using focus groups to develop ads? I don't see a difference there, but but I think that's, for me, that's why I don't see an ethical issue with the way that marketers are using it. And then the last thing to recognize goes back to this issue of not just, is that in practice, most of the neuromarketing companies are not using neuroimaging. That what they're using are techniques such as eye tracking. What they're calling neuromarketing are techniques such as eye tracking, techniques such as physiological measures, heart rate, skin conductance, et cetera, that are less expensive than imaging, more widely available than imaging, more easily usable in market-type settings than functional imaging is. And there, I think, when it comes back to, is there an ethical question here? I think if you were of the opinion that a line needed to be drawn, now you have to figure out where, what's private and what's not. Certainly it's not invasive to measure where your eyes are looking, but where our eyes are looking is not always under conscious control, as anyone who's told their toddlers to stop staring recognizes, or as men are often apt to recognize. So there is private information in things like measuring eye movements that you can use to in these approaches. And so if you want to draw a line, it's going to be a muddy line to draw. And so I'll leave that there. I know that this is about an hour since we started. I'm happy to continue answering questions. I don't know when you want to break us off.
Probably 5 minutes.
Okay.